Welcome to K&D's Homestead. I'm Donna. Today I'm going to be making a special bread. It's not a loaf bread, it's not a sourdough bread, it's not even biscuits. It's called focaccia. It is absolutely delicious. I enjoy making it and I enjoy eating it. Focaccia is considered a no-knead bread. However, that does not mean there's not a little bit of labor that goes into it. It takes some time, although it's not a lot of hands-on time. For the recipe that I use, there's 4 stages of rise and what we call proofing, each at 15 minutes apiece, and then a final rise of 1 hour. So there is some time involved, but there's very little hands-on involvement, so it's easy to make, in my opinion, and it's almost a fail-proof bread. It's very crispy on the outside and so soft and airy on the inside. The outside is salty and buttery and has whatever herbs as a topping that you like to eat. And when I say it's a no-knead bread, meaning you don't have to do any kneading, you do have to do a little bit of folding. But it's simple, it's quick, and it's so easy to make. This bread is a delicious bread to use as a dipping bread. It's great as a standalone on the side, as a side dish with your regular meal, but it's terrific as a side for spaghetti, chili, salsas, even vinaigrettes and dressings. As a dipping bread, it is so good. I'm going to share the recipe that I used today. But before I actually start to make this bread, I thought it'd be a good time to go over some basics about flour. I know for people who have never actually done a lot of bread making, it can be intimidating, and bread is high on everybody's to-do list. So let's take some of the scary out of it and let's make it a simple process. And at first it is a little intimidating, but with a little practice and a few mistakes, the art of baking bread can become second nature without any worries or fear. If you've read anything about bread, you've come across the term leavening. Leavening is just simply rise or lift. And there are many ingredients that act as leavening agents. Leavening agents react with ingredients and form carbon dioxide gas. That carbon dioxide gas creates air bubbles and forms air pockets, and giving dough its texture and airiness. There are many types of flour. I mean, the list is pretty long, but I'm going to only talk about the 3 main types that I use, and that is all-purpose flour, self-rising flour, and bread flour. And I try to keep all 3 in my pantry at all times. A few of those leavening agents can include baking powder, baking soda, salt, butter or fat, milk or any liquid that is used, and sugar, and a whole bunch of others. Those things are leavening agents, and mixed with the ingredients in your dough is going to create that particular rise that you need. As a standard rule, each type of flour is milled to have a specific percentage of protein, which creates gluten. The gluten is what gives the rise. Gluten is formed by linking the proteins together. This action develops the dough's elasticity and stretch, and it creates tenderness in the dough. Each bag of flour will tell you somewhere written on that bag what the protein percentage is, and that percentage determines that flour's strength. Self-rising will be about 8.5% protein. You're going to use self-rising to make cakes. You can use self-rising for biscuits, for cobblers, anything that you want a good rise. You're going to probably reach for self-rising flour, or the recipe is going to probably call for self-rising flour most of the time. Now, what makes it self-rising is the fact that it already has included in the flour your baking powder and your salt. Those are the leavening agents that give rise to that flour, which will be the dough when you start working with it. All-purpose flour that is just all-purpose, and it is the same basically as plain flour. Sometimes a recipe will say all-purpose and sometimes it'll just say plain, but all-purpose is what you're going to use, and you will add the leavening agents into that if the recipe calls for it. All-purpose flour works really well for pie shells because you're not going to want a terrific rise on your pie shells. Anything, and cookies like chocolate chip cookies, the thinner items, you're not going to want a giant rise, and so it's best to turn to the all-purpose flour for that. Now, you can, in a pinch, if you only have all-purpose, you can turn your all-purpose flour into self-rising flour. Let's say you just have all-purpose, but you want to make a recipe and it calls for self-rising. You can add the leavening agents to make that a self-rising flour. In order to easily convert your all-purpose flour into self-rising flour, for each cup of flour, you will add 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder and 1/4 teaspoon of salt. That's for each cup of flour. So if your recipe calls for 3 cups of flour, you're going to triple the baking soda and the salt by that measurement. So let me make the math easy for myself. Let's say your recipe calls for 2 cups of flour. You will use 3 teaspoons, because it's 1.5 per cup, 3 teaspoons of baking powder and 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And you mix that in, incorporate it really, really good. Not just throw it in and swish it. You want it really incorporated good so that that powder and salt is spread throughout the flour. Then you have self-rising flour. All-purpose flour is generally 11.7% protein, and all-purpose flour is not self-rising. Bread flour is 12.7% protein. This is a good choice when you're making breads of any kind, whether it's yeast breads, sandwich breads, and loaf breads are best made with bread flour. And bread flour is not self-rising. You have to add your leavening agents, and in most cases there's going to be some yeast involved. And while learning about flour, it's important to understand how to measure flour. You just have greater results if you measure properly, and that does not include digging down with a measuring cup and dumping it in, because what you're doing is you're compacting your flour, which will result in having an excess amount of flour in your dough recipe, and it doesn't call for it. That can make your dough, which your bread or whatever you're baking, be too dense, really. I mean, I've done it. It makes it too dense and makes it a very heavy loaf. So if something calls for 2 cups of flour, the best way to measure is have 2 measuring devices, or a dipping device and a measuring cup. You fluff that flour, you dip that flour out, and you put it in your measuring cup, and then you level it off with a spatula, a knife blade, or something. But you don't have your measurement rounded over and it's not compacted. That is a more precise measurement. An even more precise measurement of flour is by weighing it. When you're using the measuring cup, that is measured by volume, but when you are using it by weight, and a lot of recipes will, have so many grams of flour, then that is weight and needs to be weighed on scales. If you have kitchen scales, you will be more precise in making your baked goods if you weigh them, because you can take so many grams of flour and compare that to so many cups of flour, and they're not gonna equal the same. You're closer and more precise if you can weigh them. If you can't, then it is close enough as long as you measure properly and you're not compacting that flour, because it makes a big difference. Even if you only have 2 extra teaspoons of flour, it can make that dough more dense and a lot heavier and a lot more tougher to chew, the finished product. And when it comes to kneading dough, if a recipe calls for it, it's important to do it. It does not have to be complicated, but it can be an art form once you learn how to do it. And it is important to knead the dough, because that helps to form the gluten, which in turn helps to form the structure of the dough. It will create a smooth, elastic dough with a good rise. There are some exceptions where you don't have to knead dough, and that's when you're making drop biscuits or when you're making focaccia. Focaccia gets folded rather than having to knead that dough. Focaccia dough needs to rest to rise and then be folded again, rest again to rise, and fold it again multiple times. This is called proofing, when you are allowing dough to rest. When it's resting, all that chemistry stuff goes on inside of the dough and it starts working the magic. So it is important to proof most dough. And proofing can happen in the microwave if you've got a warm microwave. A lot of stoves nowadays have a proofing setting on the stove. My dehydrator even has a proofing setting. So there's lots of ways, but most of the time proofing will take place perfectly fine if the bowl is covered, the dough is in a warm place to just sit for however long that recipe calls for. All right, let's make some focaccia. I'm going to start with 3 cups of flour. This is going to be my working bowl, and this is going to be my sacrifice bowl, where I'm going to measure my flour over here and scrape off what I don't need, and then the final measurement is going to go in there. So I have gotten the flour out of my container, and I'm going to pour it in here and fluff it around. I need just a little bit more. So it's fluffed, it's not packed in there. And then I'm just going to use a knife and I'm going to cut this down with the blade, and I'm going to scrape off the excess. A level measurement is the proper way to measure flour. And the flour that this recipe calls for is all-purpose flour, 3 cups of that. Cutting it in will prevent air pockets. There's my 3 cups of all-purpose flour, and all of this will go back into my container. I need 1½ teaspoons of salt. There's 1 and half. I need 1 teaspoon of sugar. I need 1 teaspoon of instant yeast. I want that to be 1 level teaspoon. I keep my yeast in the freezer to keep it inactive, and it stores a whole lot longer in the freezer. This is all of the dry ingredients, and I'm going to mix them up and get them incorporated really well before I add my liquids. Now I'm going to use 1¼ cups of water that is heated to 110 degrees. I have a thermometer here where I can check my water, and it is 110 degrees. Now I'm going to use this wooden spoon and stir it all up. It will be a little sticky until we start going through the sessions to rise. Now I'm just going to cover this with a plate and let it sit for 15 minutes. The first 15 minutes are up. I'm going to do this 4 times at 15 minutes each. And what I'm going to do this time, I'm going to take my spoon and I'm going to drag all of the dough towards the center all the way around. It might be better with my spatula. So this is folding, and we're going to just drag the dough all the way around. It might take 8 to 10 times, 12 times. Just drag it up off the bowl and towards the center. I generally just press it down into the center. Now at this point, this bowl is getting really sticky. And what I do is I will transfer this into a bowl with some olive oil. So I'm just going to add just a little bit of olive oil to this. And then I'm going to transfer this dough into the olive oil. I'm going to turn it in this olive oil. This is ready for 15 more minutes under the plate. All right, my second round of proofing for 15 minutes is over, and at this point I'm going to spread the center out as best I can. And I'm going to add 1.5 tablespoons of olive oil. It's going to end up with a lot of olive oil before it's over with. Now I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to drag the corners towards the center and push it down and try to incorporate that olive oil into the dough. You can use your hands as well, and you stretch and fold, stretch and fold. There's not a precise way to do this, like it does not have to be precision. This is just folding the dough over itself. After you've done that to where you feel like you've made it all the way around the dough, cover it another 15 minutes. This will be the third of 4 times. Now to fold for the 4th time. Last rise, 15 minutes. My last 15 minutes of proofing in this bowl is done. Now what I'm going to do is take it out. This is the bowl I'm going to bake it in. It's a 9x3. And I'm going to spread some olive oil in here. This recipe, you cannot use too much olive oil. I'm just going to use my hands and spread it nice and thick. I need a little more. A lot of this olive oil will bake into the bread, but it will also help it to slide out of the dish after it's done baking. So now I'm going to take it out of this bowl . I can do it without dropping it. And I'm going to spread it out. You'll be able to feel how fluffy it is. I'm spreading but not tearing. I want to get it all the way to each edge as much as possible. There's a lot of spring back on it. And then you take your fingers and you dimple in the bread. If they're sticking, you can use water, and I think I will. Pressing down into the dish. I'm trying to make dimples and bubbles. Dipping your fingers in water will keep the dough from sticking. And the final rise will be 1 hour. I'm going to cover it with a piece of plastic wrap and set it in my microwave. I've got it in the microwave, and I said 1 hour. It really is 1.5 hours to rest under the plastic wrap. Okay, all of the proofing time is done. Now it's time to poke it one more time. I need water. Making these dimples are important because they're going to hold seasoning and olive oil. Spread olive oil on the top. Let it go down into all of the dimples. I probably should have put the olive oil first and then make the dimples. Either way. I'm going to sprinkle some kosher salt on top, some very coarse kosher salt. A tiny bit of garlic salt. And I'm going to top it with some parsley. A lot of people like to use rosemary. I'm not a fan of rosemary on the bread, so I don't do it. Any herbs will do that will give flavor to the top of this bread. This is going to go in the oven at 475, a preheated oven, and bake for approximately 15 to 18 minutes. Depending on the oven, it could be 20. It could be 15. Golden brown, not burnt, but a real pretty golden, crispy top, and you'll know it's done. That was 19 minutes for my oven, and it needs to come out immediately using a spatula and moved over to a cooling rack. Let this cool for a few minutes before trying to cut it. It is hot. Time for a taste test. It has a really good crunch on the outside, and it is so soft and fluffy and airy on the inside. That's good. The garlic and the coarse kosher salt really just kicks it off, gives it so much flavor. I love this bread. Like I said earlier in the video, it's a good dipping bread for soups, stews, chili, spaghetti. It's also a standalone side item that's really good. And you can cut the whole thing in half and make sandwich bread out of it. And that's probably what we're going to do tonight. I have fried up some cube steak, and I think we're going to have cube steak sandwiches with this bread. If you've never made focaccia, it is so worth your labor. Even though it's not hard labor, it just gets spread out over time. So it does take some time altogether, about 3 hours involved in making it, but it is so worth it. It's so delicious. I will put the recipe in the description below if anybody wants to use the recipe. If you've never tried it, I hope that you will. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button if you're not a subscriber. The notification bell as well, so you'll be notified when I upload more content if you're wanting to follow my channel. That's it for this video. I hope y'all have a wonderful day. Bye-bye. I have to have some more of this.